Hi, everyone. How are you feeling today? Good? Good. It's good to see you all. A huge thank you to our partners at Resolver. Thank you, George, Fiona, Chloe, Henry, for your great partnership. It's been a pleasure working together, and we hope to continue to work together again. Thank you to the team at Union Stage, Jacqueline, Chris, Billy, Allie. Thank you to Sherwin. Thank you to Zoe for photographing and the videography tonight. You're doing amazing, sweetie. I'm excited to moderate the first panel. We want to set the scene a little bit with how the night is going to go.
We definitely are, and thank you for all of that. Let's give it up for Sandra Khalil, who's our hype woman. Yeah, thank you. You know, like a lot of people, I say, well, what drew you into All Tech is Human? And they say, well, Sandra did. You know, so honestly, let's give a round of applause to like in-person gatherings. I can't tell you how many people, yes, let's give it up. We need energy. And that's also why we're not at some boring hall. We're not at like some fancy academic institution. We're in the basement of a rock hall, right? And it's also because, raise your hand if you're involved in trust and safety, right? Think about that, right? Trust and safety professionals are the rock stars of the internet, but I gotta tell you, you oftentimes feel like the roadie, right? Everybody's ragging on you from all different directions, but that's why we're coming together, Sandra, right? Because
For sure.
we need each other. We need people from all different backgrounds across civil society, government, industry, academia. So just look around the room. For today's setting, Sandra's leading our first panel, then we're gonna have a quick 5-minute break. We're gonna hold you responsible for that 5 minutes. We're gonna try to be on time here, right? Very punctual. Then we get into our second panel. After that ends, I come out here for a little bookend closing, thank everybody, and then get back to the networking, because that is the important part. This is not just one event. This is a continuous momentum of the responsible tech ecosystem. We need each other to understand values, tensions, trade-offs, best practices. How do we tackle these hard problems, especially in an area like DC? As Sandra mentioned, right, most of our team based in New York, but we love DC. We were here last February 28th for a trust and safety event. But I gotta say, Sandra, I think things have changed in DC since February. So I just want you to imagine right now, maybe it's good fodder for your discussion with your friends, your new friends that you're gonna make tonight when you're talking over a cocktail or a non-alcoholic beverage or a beer or a non-alcoholic beer that they have now. What you wanna think about is, imagine a GIF for the turmoil right now in DC, right? What would that GIF be? What would you send somebody right now on WhatsApp to describe DC? Mm-hmm. And I say that because that's the important part of a global responsible tech network. Because we're DC, and then we're going over to London, then we're back in New York, then we go to San Francisco. We need to connect people for this learning, to understand each other, to work together. Mm-hmm. Don't want to take up too much time. Again, just want to thank all of you for being here. That's how All Tech is Human runs, right? If Dunkin' Donuts, right, if America runs on Dunkin', All Tech is Human runs on people, right? It really does. Because, I mean, I'll trademark that after. We'll get Ben Affleck and Matt Damon. We'll see if we can afford them. But the point is, so if there's any funders, let's up this for, you know, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. I heard they're a little pricey after the divorce. So the point is, right, we need each other, and it's people that really runs All Tech is Human. Mm-hmm. So we come together, we work together, we try to understand each other. That's why we do the networking. That's why we do the learning. So let's just have that in our mind's eye when we're thinking about these discussions today. But Sandra, I'm gonna hand it over to you to run the first panel. So
Thank
again,
you so much.
Let's give it up for the first panel for Sandra.
Yes, thank you so much, David. Please give another hand welcoming our first panel. Can I have Katie Harbath, Joy Park, and Aliya Bhatia join me up on stage? Oh, let's just make sure the mics are close to. Hello, hello, hello. Okay.
Testing, testing.
Yes.
Hello, hello. Oh, these lights are bright.
Yes. So I have the pleasure of moderating our first panel of the evening on the trust and safety policy landscape, where we're at, where we're going, what the current state of affairs are. We'll do some quick intros and scene setting, but I also would love in your introduction to answer the following question. With the recent developments in trust and safety policy landscape, legislation, layoffs, et cetera, what's changed and what's remained the same? And how are platforms adjusting their approach? So are there new models emerging, or are there fewer people doing more work, frankly? Katie, we'll start with you, please.
That question could be an entire conversation. Hey, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Katie Harbath. I run a company called Anchor Change, which is really just me doing consulting, writing a newsletter, doing a podcast around this intersection of technology and politics and policy. It's so nice to see so many friendly faces. I can't see you at the moment. The lights are too bright, but like I proverbially can see you. I think that it's a complicated question because the work continues to happen. Mm-hmm. The work is happening of trust and safety. Like there's so much of it that continues to happen. So many of you in this room continue to do the work day in and day out that you need to do. How it is being portrayed publicly, how we need to think about reframing it, how we also need to think about like, where did we maybe go too far? Where did we maybe not go far enough? Where a recalibration is not a bad thing, right? Because I think that we're all kind of learning and experimenting as we go with this. And so, but it is a tumultuous time at the moment. And we're in the middle of the chaos, and the chaos is going to continue for a while. So it's really hard to say. It's hard to pinpoint it because it's going to change in 5 minutes, it's going to change in an hour, it's going to change tomorrow with all of that. But I think that the constant that we see is that the people in this room and others in trust and safety continue to try do the work to keep people protected on the internet. That's what people want. That's what the markets want. That's what everyone else wants. But how we necessarily sell that, how we deal with the politics of that has changed quite a bit. And we see different tech companies taking different approaches to that and what that looks like. And so that's a hard thing because it can be frustrating to be like, we're still doing the work, but it's being portrayed differently externally. But sometimes we go through these phases and we need to figure out how to ride them while we go into the next one.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joy Park, and I work at Google, and I work on Play Store's policy and the Android ecosystem's policy. So how I think about that question is, I think trust and safety is changing all the time. And policies are changing all the time, right? We're never stopped changing. That's why we all have for jobs for more than a few years. So I don't think change is necessarily bad or unusual. I think some change can be more frustrating than others, but it's also kind of trust and safety's job to kind of do the right thing and hold the right principles. I think for sure there's technology that's impacting our work, which AI can potentially help us moderate more efficiently, or it can also bring more harm. So there's those kind of changes in technologies that we have to think about, but I don't think it's necessarily anything different than changes just throughout the past years.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aliya Bhatia. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology. If you don't know who CDT is, we are a 30-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan civil society organization here in DC. And we've been working on content moderation related issues for, I think, the entire 30 years, if not longer. And so I think the way I think about this question is, I think one thing that's not changed is that content moderation is and will always be difficult. I think ultimately what trust and safety folks and professionals are tasked with is trying to develop rules for how society should govern. And I don't think any one of us has like the answer to that question. And if you do, please find me it'll make the paper I'm writing.
Bullet, why I've been holding back.
Right. It'll make the paper I'm writing so much easier. So please just find me at the bar afterwards. But I think, ultimately trust and safety professionals have always been the sort of arbiters of who can speak online, how people can access services, and what the sort of rules of engagement have been. And so no matter administration or global landscape, that has always been a difficult question. I think what has changed, however, is that we are entering a sort of patchwork and fragmentation of a policy landscape. Just here in the United States, we have states competing with each other and setting rules that are sometimes in conflict with one another. And I think that has sort of made trust and safety work just really confusing. I mean, if you're thinking about like what a person in Utah can say to a person in Montana, like that is being governed by laws and policies right now, and that is changing. And I think the impact of these content moderation bills and approaches are changing the work of trust and safety, sometimes to the more confusing or to the more just complete like dissolution of like uniform standard. And I think, you know, I think one thing that has evolved also is just the tools. I think we have more automated tools right now to make trust and safety easier. I'm really heartened by the advancements in technologies that can help potentially limit the exposure of really, really worrying content, exposure of humans to really worrying content. So I think that is a huge advantage. But I think it would be like, we would be remiss to not like sort of talk about the broader global landscape of like the erosion of human rights. I think one thing that has made trust and safety work just enormously difficult is just the sort of weaponization and undermining of human rights practices and principles around the world. And I think that's made trust and safety professionals play even more of a strident role in being the arbiters of human rights. Today, they are now in charge of deciding who can actually speak up about their government, who can say what, and how they can access online services to communicate with people outside of the country, et cetera. So I think all of those factors are really important when we think about trust and safety.
Yeah, Aliya, I totally plus one the complexities of having a patchwork of legislation across states in the US and what that looks like when it comes to enforcement. I'd love to pull that thread a little bit more because you've worked at the intersection of TNS policy and practice, especially in helping policymakers understand how content moderation works. So where have you seen between legislation and the day-to-day TNS operations the most significant disconnect in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, to Katie's point, like there is no silver bullet. And I think that there is sometimes like a desire, very, you know, like well-meaning desire for policymakers to find or develop bills with the premise or with the belief that there is a silver bullet. Oh, if we have a law that limits hate speech or misinformation on the internet, then we can just like make it so that people will never lie or people will never be rude to each other. People are always going to find new and more innovative ways to circumvent moderation, to change their language, use in-group, out-group language. A lot of my research at CDT has been looking at how do people code mix online, how do people sort of speak bilingually, trilingually on the internet. And let me tell you, people are creative. They are finding new forms of algo speak, as many of you know, ways to speak online. And so I think we really need to think a lot more about like what is policy's role here. I don't think policy's role is perhaps to always intervene at the sort of speech level, and there are other ways to do it. But I think that's one big disconnect sometimes I face. And then the second is a wishful thinking about how technology works, a belief that if we had the right AI, if we tuned the AI system on all the code words, that it would just magically remove content at scale. But I think one thing CDT's been working a lot on for a long time is thinking about how those tools can sometimes erode the same rights or make people more unsafe, even though they were tasked with making people safe. So, for example, a lot of companies have used sort of automated solutions to manage trust and safety operations or to limit the spread of hate speech, misinformation, things like that, or election denialism, for example. But sometimes they're trained on keywords that used in other contexts are critical for the way people speak. So for example, if I trained an automated system to limit the times people can say, I want to kill you, then it will also remove a lot of speech that I just send my sister when she's bugging me, right? And so we need to think about like, how do we make sure that like tools are being promoted, are being improved. We're creating the incentive structure for companies to improve the tools, but we're not sort of like mandating by law the use of automated tools that we know are error prone, and we're by virtue of mandating them, scaling that error across platforms.
Joy, you've been steeped in both international human rights law and tech policy. So in your eyes, how do current TNS frameworks address or fail to address harms unique to vulnerable populations, especially when those are being amplified by AI tools?
I'll start with a bit of the positive, which is I think in our policy development, a lot of times the policy leads really have the best intentions, and we really try to take into account how does this affect some of the very vulnerable populations like underage users or human rights activists or women in general. And those elements are they're very comfortably set in the policy development principles that we already have. It kind of comes naturally for a lot of, I think, trust and safety professionals that they kind of just naturally consider these things when they're making policies. And I think at some companies, they're probably written into their framework as well, certainly at Google. So I think that's a good thing that it's already incorporated into a lot of the policy making. I think that failures or sometimes like challenges lies a lot in enforcement. I think in trust and safety we talk about that a lot. It's, we've written the rules, but we're just never going to be able to enforce them 100% perfectly. And that can be, for example, if we're talking about an area that maybe impacts very specifically human rights activists, how do we even identify that they're human rights activists? It might not be apparent from their online activity, so how do we know to especially protect them? I think a lot of times, like what we've seen with AI recently is that once the tech is out there, a lot of people will try to use it maliciously. For revenue or whatever reasons, and so then the harm comes up very quickly, and maybe for the companies, they're not quite ready and don't have the systems in place to address that. So then we have to spring up something very quickly. And an example I think I can give is deepfake. So there's a lot of image generator apps on the Play Store that use AI, and sometimes some of them can generate sexual content. And I think for some, it might be unintentional. It might be that developers feel they just don't have the right tools, or maybe they don't have the right knowledge to implement the right filtering system. But some developers may be malicious. So we really want to target those. But detection is a problem, right? Because how much time are you going to spend in an app and kind of prompting the image generator, and how do we really find these content efficiently? That's always a challenge. For us specifically, we kind of put a group together very quickly to address that, because we see deepfakes, and especially that it has a big impact on underage users as a big problem. So over the past, I guess, year or so, we've improved a lot of our detection. I think it's gotten quite a bit better. But definitely, detection and enforcement, always a challenge.
For sure. Katie, you've been embedded in election content at a major platform for much of your career. What are the biggest challenges that you've observed when creating policies for Gen AI and its associated threat vectors under the backdrop of a government and civil society lens?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different things. One, the U.S. is the exception versus the rule, right, in terms of how elections are run around the world. And so you'll oftentimes run into US-based engineers who you kind of have to give a crash course into the difficulties of the parliamentarian system or snap elections or other things like I'm actually working with somebody right now around it would seem simple, like I would like a list of every elected official in this region. And that's actually quite a complex list in which to build out and how to figure out. And so you kind of have to explain that to them. So I think that's a challenge of what that looks like. And the fact that there's not a simple API or a simple database in which to plug into to do what it is that you would like. Two, I think that there continues to be, forgive me to use an American football term, but we've not yet hit the last 20 yards between the civil society groups and tech. And one of my biggest frustrations is that we get a lot of really great recommendations out of civil society, but they don't do it in a way that speaks to the tech, to the platforms, and how they can implement those. And that continues to be a challenge, because just coming out with a report that's like, do less hate speech, well, yeah, we're all trying to do that. What does that mean? Can we actually, like, when you start to get down to the nitty-gritty and the hard trade-offs, the impossible trade-offs as I talk about them, the more that I get into that, the more people start to retreat because they don't want to actually talk about those tough trade-offs. Mm-hmm. But that's where the conversation needs to happen to really understand a lot of this. And then when we get into the Gen AI perspective, because it is different than social media, and so that's a challenge. So when I was in San Francisco, the tech companies are way over here on AI. They've gone through the thought processes, right? Folks here in DC are now still pulling me aside being like, can you teach me how to use AI? Like, what's a prompt? Like, what's a data set? Like, because they don't know, mm-hmm. because we kind of expected them to jump right away to the spot where the tech world was at without giving them any education of how it's different than social media. So there's this huge educational component we're trying to do while everyone's also grieving and going through just the utter effing chaos we've gone through over the last 4.5 months. That's a lot to ask people to change their mindset for, but things are moving quickly and we need to start adapting to that. And that's a challenge of getting folks to move at the speed of tech, mm-hmm. in a governmental world, in a nonprofit world, in a civil society world that's not used to doing that. So we have this kaleidoscope of problems that we're all trying to sort of catch up to, and we're all in different spots of doing that. And so how you bring a productive group of people together to think about that is some of the bigger challenges right now. But again, I will say that even if it's not like popular to be talking about in public, I still am getting a lot of questions from tech companies and others who are wanting to continue to do this work and kind of figure out like, okay, how do we continue to make sure that elections are safe and secure? How do we make sure that people are safe online? All of that, but how do we do that and survive the current political climate?
I think it's so important to note that like there are tech companies approaching you to continue doing this work where the majority of folks have been saying that kind of work is being deprioritized because we are out of an election year in the US. So it's really encouraging to hear that.
Well, and if I can just add, please just take a difference between what they're saying publicly versus what's actually happening at the companies. Because I think there's a big difference there between, and this is where the nuance, like I know we as humans love to see things as binaries, and it can seem that way when certain companies do certain announcements on January 7th, around what it is they are or not doing. But then we really do need to look at the execution of that and what's actually happening to really understand what is it they're doing versus what are they trying to project or what image are they trying to project to certain people.
That's a totally fair point. Aliya, I want to go back to you because we've talked a bit about your work with the TNS vendor ecosystem. I like that. That's good. The TNS vendor ecosystem.
We're getting real. Stick the mic out of the...
We might do a duet later. You talked about the TNS vendor ecosystem you advise them on user rights, multilingual considerations. How do the current regulatory approaches account for these nuances that you work on, and where do you see them falling short?
Yeah, so that's a really good and really big question. So I'm going to break it up in a couple of chunks. So first I'll say is that for many different reasons, including the factors we're talking about, but also the regulatory shift and desire for a lot of governments around the world to, develop and implement online harms regulation. Also driven by a lot of the layoffs where people, with amazing expertise within the tech companies wanted to create their own startups and sort of externalize the lessons or share the lessons they learned within the tech companies outward. We have this now really vibrant ecosystem of trust and safety vendors, these third-party consultancy groups. Katie, I know you're running one and also like working with a couple. And all of these efforts come from a really good place, which is like, how can we all learn from each other and share some of the insights? If one engineer figured out, like this is a really good threshold at which to set your hate speech classifier, shouldn't that person share it externally outside the sort of shroud of secrecy or NDA within tech companies? So I think what vendors are doing is enabling conversation amongst tech companies. But I think one thing the vendor ecosystem, I think, can learn and also like do a little more, and that's something that we at CDT think about, is how can they sort of talk to or also sort of operationalize a lot of the civil society guidance that has gone into the ether sometimes or been produced at a scale that's like hard to read or hard to capture, and share that again to become like sort of industry best practice. There's been a lot of work within civil society being done about developing human rights friendly transparency reports or ways to think about real name policies in a human right respecting way. How can we take those lessons and take them to vendors and consultants who are going to be the front lines for trust and safety policies for the companies? So that's a little bit about how I think about vendors. And then a parallel work stream that I work on a lot is I lead our work on multilingual trust and safety. Now, as all of us know, these companies are operating at a scale that is just unfathomable. They're operating for billions of users around the world, for billions of different needs and contexts. And as someone who comes from outside the United States, I think language is really, really important. It's a proxy for access. It's a proxy for belonging. It's a proxy for inclusion. And I think, typically, tech companies have struggled with building equitable multilingual trust and safety tools purely because of the prioritization of resources, because as Katie mentioned, these are engineers with their own sort of resource constraints, personal, language familiarity, et cetera. And so what we do at CDT is think a lot about like, what are the sort of opportunities to fix and improve multilingual trust and safety, again, with the caveat that there's no fixing, right? Like, I think one thing we need to do is redefine what success is. There's not going to be 100% internet 100% free of hate. Like that, for that to happen, people just do not need to exist, right? Like people need to like
shut
be
the internet
kinder
down.
to each other. Right. So I think what we're thinking a lot about is like, how do we actually enable participatorily driven or participatorily created trust and safety practices, getting companies or getting vendors who are developing multilingual tools to do the sort of very difficult subject matter expertise engagement, civil society engagement, and build data sets that better reflect those language communities' expertise, familiarity with the language. For example, what slang sound like in Bengali, in French, in Haitian Creole? Let's develop lexicons and tools in these languages that are developed by people who speak the languages, and then make that available widely so that if a tech company is like, oh, I can see a spike in sort of questionable activity happening in Brazil, okay, let me go to the centralized repository and find the Portuguese data set, find the Portuguese evaluation metric, and just run tests on my existing systems, my existing policies, and just see what the gaps are. I think, to Katie's point again, like I think it is crazy for us to maybe expect the tech companies to do everything per language. It's expensive. I wish they deployed more money in this, but like I guess the question becomes like, who are now third-party actors, independent, both speakers, civil society, academics, creating these resources, and how can we create a pipeline so that companies actually use them? And the good news is that a lot of people are doing this. There are groups all over the world. There's Sea Lion in Southeast Asia building Southeast Asian data sets. There's Masakane in Sub-Saharan Africa. There's Arab ML in the Middle East. So this is happening, but I think we just need to create some sort of like global repository or pipeline for the exchange of resources.
I appreciate your thoughts there, and that's super important work. Joy, we touched briefly on the different jurisdictional considerations around regulation, and we've noted that platform policies often aim to reach beyond the current regulatory scope. I'm curious to know what motivates that proactive stance, and how are companies prioritizing compliance when the rules can differ so significantly across jurisdictions?
Yeah, so the first question, the regulatory standards are just not enough, right? And we're trying to retain users for tech companies and grow users, so then we have to make things safe. If we're not going to make things safe, then nobody's going to come. That's a business failure. So we definitely have great motivation for user safety. But also, when we're now in the user safety realm, in trust and safety, we're really trying our best to do right by users, and that includes the regulatory efforts, but it just needs to go beyond, because there are so many things that there is no international standard on. There are recommendations. There's no local laws. There's no hate speech law in the US. And some things are just not enough. And just because there's not a law doesn't mean that it's not right to protect. So it really needs to go way beyond regulatory efforts. So I think it's really a kind of a combination of business interests, the right principles for trust and safety, and just the greater user safety. And then I think in terms of the kind of jurisdictional differences of, if maybe this law's in Australia, but it's not in the US, what do we do? I think it kind of depends on the context, right? If it's something that is very localized, if it's maybe a legislation very specific to India, and it's a much bigger harm in India, a much bigger problem in India, or maybe if it's a law that speaks more to a certain area of more conservative countries, if we're talking about, maybe not being sexual content or like sexually suggestive, like a little bit racy, things like that, then local norms matter, but they might not matter in other countries. So we need to kind of make sure that we're applying them correctly, because just because someone has, maybe a higher standard on certain things doesn't mean other countries should and must agree with that. So then our application of those regulatory rules and how that reflects on our policy and enforcement is we have to kind of do this like very detailed analysis of, when something comes in, should we apply this across the board? Is this just right to do globally? Or is it so localized that we should geofences, which is, just apply it to the local region, right? So it really kind of depends on what it is, and every time there is an analysis going in. So usually I think if it's something that is really right to do globally, and usually I think what you'll see is maybe EU has something, and then other countries will follow. Maybe Australia follows, maybe the US, there's some sort of debate going on, there's kind of speculation that they will follow kind of the same path, then it probably makes sense for the tech companies also to just apply globally. So there's also kind of that weighing of resources of, should we really build this to apply it so specifically? Does that make sense? Or if we're anticipating a more global adoption, should we just apply it globally? So that, and then when we think about that, if we decide to apply something globally, that kind of also plays into we're now going ahead of the regulatory efforts in some countries. So they're like very tightly related. So I would say that it's kind of a complex decision, but it's like at the bottom of it, it's what makes sense, what protects users in the right way.
Katie, we touched briefly earlier on civil society policy inputs and how effective they can be. I'm curious to know how we can design resilient frameworks that actually answer the policy moment we're in, but also resist the political winds that you mentioned earlier. So like, what efforts are you seeing to build bridges between civil society and trust and safety writ large to make those inputs more actionable and less symbolic?
Yeah. If I'm honest, I'm not seeing very many bridges right now. I'm just like, everyone's a little bit of recalibrating on both of their own, and it's more than just one side, right? Like, this is a bridge that has many different avenues and ways that you can go around it. I need to think of a better metaphor for that. But if I'm just honest, like, I do feel that, like, there's a bit of a retreating that has happened while people regroup at the moment. But I think that that's not going to sustain. And I do oftentimes like to remind myself and others, you know, after 2016, 2017, it took a while. It took a decent amount of that year and into 2018 for this industry to even start developing. And while it feels like 4 years, it has only been 4 months of the Trump administration. I know, I'm sorry. I didn't mean, like, there's wine, beer, go. I brought it up on stage just to get me through. But I do think that I still see the core, the spirit of it all still exists, right? There's an undercurrent of that we're all trying to figure out where we can exist, which one of us are going to be the ones that are going to be able to be more public, which ones are the folks that need to be more behind the scenes, how do those of us who are more public help to amplify those who are behind the scenes but not put a target on their back with what is happening. And the political winds go both ways. The political winds, right, we've all been in, maybe not all of us, but many of us have been in rooms where we're getting yelled at from multiple sides of what people feel like they should or what should or should not happen. That's just in the US, let alone the global perspective of what is happening. And so I think that where we are in this moment is and I really want to try to convey to folks, is the opportunity in the chaos. The opportunity, and David would kill me if I didn't use this phrase on the stage, to panic responsibly. So if any of you know me, this is the mantra I've adopted since 2023. You can go, there's a merch store, panicresponsibly.com, if you'd like to get a t-shirt, wine glass, anything you want. But to me, it means separating the signal from the noise. It doesn't mean ignoring the harms. It means being able to better identify where those harms are happening, where we can have the most impact, while also separating out the noise from what is happening. And let's be honest, there is a ton of noise happening right now on the political spectrum. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't still have your eyes focused on that North Star that you have and I agree, there is not a single definition of what a success looks like. There is not going to be, I hate to say it, there's not going to be a point in time where we're going to have a big party and be like, we figured out safety on the internet. Just not going to happen. But as long as we all continue to have conversations, as long as we all continue to work together, as long as we're willing to have the honest conversations about where we want the boundaries to be drawn, where we want that to look like, so that civil society can have a place at the table. So there is that closing feedback loop. Because I'm sure many of you were in a room with me when I was at Facebook and you were like, I gave Katie a bunch of opinions. I don't know what happened to them. Because we weren't very good at coming back to you and saying, here's how that impacted our decisions or not, or here were many other voices that we were having. So I say all of that in trying to be like, don't give up, like this work really matters and we're all trying to recalibrate in the moment. And the best thing that we're learning at the moment is how to ride these different political waves to figure out and also accept, look back critically on the work that we've done and be like, oh, maybe maybe we went a little too far. Maybe we didn't go far enough. Maybe we defined it wrong. Like, I bet there's a bunch of people in this room who are really mad at how we initially defined political ads in 2018. Come find me at the bar. I'll explain to you why. But we had to make decisions and prioritizations at the time of what that looked like. So I say all of that to mean that, like, we are in this period of transition right now, and we should give ourselves grace while we are in this position of transition, and also be something where we continue to talk about it and rethink about what can the future look like and how can we pivot quickly along with like what might be happening, and accept it and be okay with being like, oh, maybe I do need to adjust this a little bit. And how can I find more? The more that we can have folks in this room, the folks that are at the companies like Joy and civil society coming together to have these conversations helps us to bridge that translation gap of when you have an engineer being like, no, this is how the product works, and a civil society person being like, well, I want this, and they just are not speaking the same language. So how do we continue to bridge that? And I think we continue to get closer, but we have a lot more work to do.
I want to stay with you on that because you did touch on the future. And just to bring this conversation home, I want to ask all the panelists, and start with you, Katie, on where you see the next frontier of trust and safety focused policy. Is it self-regulation? Is it more international standards like Joy was mentioning? Is it new enforcement bodies altogether? I'd love to know from each of you, like, what is the next thing that we'll be talking about on this stage?
So I think there's something rooted in foundation. If Lawrence Lessig has this framework that I just love, which is kind of 4 pillars that come when thinking about this, which is laws, he calls it code, I kind of call it private tech companies, et cetera, market, and societal norms. And we've been in the middle of all of these being redefined in the moment. So there's something about the foundational component of it, and then there's something about, like, we get to decide. Y'all, like, we get to play a big role in figuring out what this looks like next. I find that incredibly exciting. I might just be crazy. People have called me it before. But, like, we don't know yet what that looks like. And I think that I think first and foremost, it's self-regulation by the companies. Things move way too fast for anybody else to keep up. And so it takes people at the companies. But then it does take civil society, media, and others. Regulators are going to be the tail end of it. And frankly, I'd want them to be the tail end of it, because they should be able to learn the lessons that come from the self-regulation. And then also, like, you look at, and like, I might get some groans, but the code of practice in Europe, a lot of problems with that. But there's something maybe to be learned from some of that process of it being voluntary and bringing those folks together before it gets codified in law that we can learn about for future things. So I think it's going to be all of it. I think it's going to be, and there's going to be things that we just have not even conceived yet that will happen. And I enjoy keeping that petri dish open for those wild ideas that somebody might be like at a happy hour like this being like, so I kind of had this crazy thought. And then next thing you know, 5-7 years from now, it might actually be what worked.
Sure.
You mentioned a little bit, I would love to see more international standards on just in the tech space in general. As an example, I've been looking into standards for AI content safeguards recently. There's not much. So I would love to see more of that, because then, you know, these big tech companies can come and cite them and incorporate them into their policy principles. So I would love to see more of that. And I would love to see more of probably more tech companies listening to civil society. Because I used to work in civil society in nonprofit, and I had opportunity to work with some tech companies, and I just find that to be very helpful when tech companies are willing to listen. And then another point is just to kind of touch on like the political climate a little bit. The US is one country in the world. There's political pressure from everywhere. Of course, these companies are based here. They have huge interests here. They're very influenced by the local politics. But our responsibility is to users globally. So I always try to remind my team members sometimes that don't forget that. We have to make rules and policies that make sense for everybody in the world. So also to that point, I would love to just see more. I think in general, we can probably say tech policy trust and safety in general is still quite Western focused. And I would love to just see more diversity and more understanding of how the rest of the world operates and kind of take that into consideration.
Yeah, so I have the dubious privilege to go last on this question, but +1 to everything. I think one thing I'd say is there are frameworks that exist. We do not need to recreate the wheel. There are already, any problem you think we need to solve has probably been thought about by any number of folks in the room and around the world. And to Joy's point, what's happening in the United States from a governance perspective and from a rights perspective has already been tried and executed well and operationalized around the world. So I think this is an opportunity for us to take a step back and see, are there frameworks that we can already use to keep users safe and keep users' rights intact? And there are frameworks like the Santa Clara Principles, the UNGPs, Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which companies are obligated to uphold, that sort of lay out those tricky trade-offs and those impossible trade-offs and offer a path forward of how you can sort of split the difference and navigate those issues. In instances where a law seems overbroad or doing something that seems at the odds of a company's user retention goals, there are, again, paths and frameworks that allow and help companies make that decision. So I really do think that this is an opportunity for us to take a quick inventory of what exists and how we can sort of check against those. And I think All Tech is Human, honestly, is doing a great job of just being a repository of a lot of resources that are created both in this room and others. So quick shout out to our host today. And then two other things I'll say is this sounds hokey and sort of we're having a little existential crisis right now, but multi-stakeholder collaboration, to Katie's point, let's listen to each other. I think there is this there's a little bit of magical thinking, I think, sometimes going on in companies and governments where folks are the tech is complicated, so we need the technical experts to figure it out. And it's yes, that's true, but I think we can all work together because at the end of the day, the tech interfaces with humans, and I think we need to understand how humans are being affected by these systems. So I think having arenas where we can talk about tricky problems and sort of share under, there's several ways we can share Chatham House practices, et cetera, candidly about what the challenges are and what paths we can try to pursue would be helpful in multi-stakeholder spaces with governments, companies, civil society, academics. There's so many things happening at the sort of trust and safety academia space in CHI and ACM and in so many conferences and academic spaces around the world. So I think creating arenas where we can share notes is really helpful. And finally, a related point, we need transparency. We can't have self-regulation without transparency. Companies are not going to be incentivized to follow to identify issues if users don't know what the enforcement has been and then can also say, either this policy didn't really make sense or, hey, this policy was not enforced the way the policy was stated. I think we need to empower users more to control their own information environment, and that can only happen with transparency. So I hope those two go together. So I think, I guess I'm the little kumbaya, everyone has a role, but everyone really does have a role.
Thank you, Aliya. Thank you so much, Katie, Joy, and Aliya for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you. We're going to break for 5 minutes. Make it actually 5, please. And then we'll bring on our second panel of the evening.
She's gone.